Hey everyone, today on Big Al Books, I'm doing the Reread Book Tag. This was created by Juan over at Just One Reader. I'm sure most of you are already familiar with his channel, but in case you're not, you should check it out. It is incredible. I wasn't tagged by anyone to do this, but that's never stopped me before. As you can guess from the title, this is a tag about rereading books, which I think is something that is so important and valuable, especially if you have a legitimate garbage memory like I do. Like, I'm someone who just cannot remember plot. I really can't. If I didn't write down my thoughts about a book like immediately after finishing it, they're oftentimes just going to evaporate into thin air. So rereading is so valuable for me. It gives me a chance to sometimes experience plots almost like it's the first time going through it. If it's a book that I do remember better, then that perspective of going through it, knowing what's going to happen, and seeing it all unfold before your eyes is so mesmerizing. Though I find the process of rereading to be so rewarding, I often have difficulties making time for rereading. It's almost like it's hard to justify, right? Because each book that you reread is one new book that you're not going to get to that year, which seems almost like it's a loss. And I know I shouldn't think that way because you actually gain so much from rereading a book. So last year I actually made myself reread one book every month, and I found myself really enjoying that process and looking forward to that reread every month. This year I've been a lot busier, so I haven't gotten around to rereading anything, so I thought this tag would be a good chance to think more about rereading and to start to hopefully prioritize it again in my reading life. So let's get started with the questions. Question number 1, a book from your childhood that you want to reread. Now, I read a lot of strange books as a child. Shocking, I know. But one of my favorite series were the Redwall books by Brian Jacques. They were sort of like a medieval fantasy vibe, except all of the characters were animals. They were these woodland creatures, and you always had your like good creatures that were like the mice, rabbits, moles, badgers, against the verminous creatures where you had your like weasels and stoats and ferrets. And they would come together and make war against each other. And these books were just like a lot of fun. So they were kind of like violent and gory, but yet there are also these really wonderful moments of friendship and camaraderie. The feast scenes in this book were incredible. Like anytime that there was a banquet, it was excellent. Like these animals ate well. And Brian Jacques described it all in minute detail, which I really appreciated. Question number 2, a book you want to reread because you didn't like it the first time. I'm going to go with V by Thomas Pynchon. This is his debut novel, and it's confusing as hell. And it's not that I didn't really like this book, it's just that I didn't enjoy the act of reading it. But I could still appreciate that it was a complex novel with a lot of mysterious things happening. I just didn't have the mental dedication devoted to really deciphering this book at the time. I was reading it when I was like busy and moving, so it was just the wrong time for this book. And I have since returned to other Thomas Pynchon books. I read The Crying of Lot 49 and absolutely loved it, so I feel like I need to give this one another fair shake before I start to read his other books, since I hear a lot of the themes that he addresses in here he would go on to explore in some of his other later books. So I really do want to return to this one and give it another go. Question number 3, a book you want to reread because you haven't read it for a long time. For me, I'm starting to consider high school a long time ago, so I was starting to think of some books that I haven't read since then. One of the first ones that came to my mind was Our Band Can Be Your Life, Scenes from the American Indie Underground by Michael Azerrad. I was just recently talking about this book in a comment with Tortoise Dreams, which made me miss it, and this is such a strange and delightful read. It's a bunch of profiles of a bunch of different bands that were pivotal in starting off the big alternative music scene in the late 80s, early 90s, and all of these musicians were just so strange, and so many of these scenes in this book were just hilarious. Like, there's a chapter on the band Dinosaur Jr. that is just a masterwork in psychological weirdness. Like, these 3 guys were all strange people that did not know how to relate to each other, and when you stick them in a van for a long period of time, it just erupts into craziness. So I have a lot of fond memories reading this book, and though I'm not as obsessed with indie music as I was then, I think I could still get a kick out of reading this one for a second time. Another book I haven't revisited since high school is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey. Now, I have seen the film a few times since, so the plot is pretty fresh in my memory, but I just kind of forget what the prose felt like or the experience of reading this book. And I'm particularly curious in reading about the narrator, who is an Indigenous man, and I have since read a lot of books from an Indigenous perspective, so I'm kind of curious to see how Kesey handles the character in this text. I've also read Kesey's second book, Sometimes a Great Notion, after reading this one, and I have a sneaking suspicion that that book is a little bit more superior to this one, even though this one's a lot more well-known and iconic. So I'd like to compare the two books, see how I feel about Ken Kesey after all of these years, and I am looking forward to rereading this one, even though I know that I shouldn't, because I'm sure it will be just as emotionally devastating the second time around. Question number 4, a book you want to reread because you didn't understand it the first time around. Now, I think that there's no shame in this, especially since there are some books out there that are like designed to be impossible to understand unless you read it twice, which is cruel. One of those books is definitely Absalom, Absalom by William Faulkner. This thing seems to make no sense in the beginning, and it really takes a second close read to appreciate how well this book is constructed. My answer for this question has to be Naked Lunch by William Burroughs. This is, again, another book that I haven't visited since high school. I remember picking up William Burroughs because he did a collaboration with Kurt Cobain, who was my idol at the time. So I thought, who's this weird old man writer that Kurt Cobain's hanging around? I should check out his stuff. And I did. And I feel like I understood maybe like a generous 5% of what's going on in this book. And I feel like even now, reading it again over 10 years later, I'm still maybe going to understand like 15% of what's going on here. Like, I don't do hard drugs. I'm not really in the kind of headspace that William Burroughs is. I have very little memories of this book, except that it was just like way too crazy for me, but I wanted to be edgy, so I was like trying really hard to like it. So I'm super curious to return to this one to see if I actually connect to anything, or if I've gotten actually dumber over the years and I understand even less than I did when I was 16. Question number 5, a book you'd even like more upon a second read. I think this is true with most books, especially since when you're going through a book a second time, you can really appreciate the craft of a novelist putting this thing together. So I tend to just love reading books for a second time, and I usually only gain appreciation. Now, there is one author who I have never reread any of her books, and I definitely need to do that, and that is Virginia Woolf. Now, she is just one of the most brilliant writers I have ever read in my life. And every time I come away from one of her books, I feel like I have only just begun to skim the surface of this great depth, this world of meaning that lies underneath her texts. And I find that really exciting as a reader, and I feel so challenged, and like I really look forward to reading her books, which I haven't done yet. So I haven't read Mrs. Dalloway for a really long time, so that was my first Virginia Woolf, and one that I would really love to revisit. Same with To the Lighthouse. It's been a few years since I tackled this one. I'd also like to revisit The Waves, although not anytime soon, because this book was just on a whole different level, and I'm not ready to go back there yet. But The Waves is just a book you could keep reading through different periods of your life, and I feel like you'd respond to different ideas of this text. So I think Virginia Woolf writes such rich fiction that you're going to gain a deeper understanding each time that you return to her works. Question number 6, a book you will reread for the rest of your life. Hopefully that will be a lot of my books. I mean, that's the reason that I like to justify purchasing so many books, right? Instead of acknowledging that it might just be some kind of book buying addiction, I like to tell myself, no, it's a collection, and when I reread all my books, they'll be right there on the shelf for me waiting. So in order to keep justifying buying books, I definitely need to continue to reread all of them forever. But there are some books that I know I'm just going to enjoy returning to again and again. I love rereading The Master and Margarita, particularly in the month of August. That is just the sweet spot for me. I think it's also worth mentioning the stories in Labyrinths by Jorge Luis Borges. These stories are just so mind-blowing. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to figure them out. And the last book I wanted to mention is Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes. And this is the kind of book that you could just return to your whole life because it's kind of like a comfort read. It's so nice returning to the world in this book. So I'm sure that I'm going to be rereading this one a lot throughout my life. So those are my thoughts on rereading. Let me know if you enjoy rereading, or if there was a particular book that you felt like you got on like a different level after reading it again for a second time. Thank you so much for watching. I have been procrastinating filming this video, trying to avoid the pile of marking that I'm currently buried under, so I should probably get back to that, but thanks for tuning in, and I will see you next time.